Tens of thousands of football fans came to Highbury. Electrifying!
Yes, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Cannon Podcast. I am back with my lovely Wohan, and we are here for a double dose of trouble this week. How are you doing, mate? You good?
I'm doing great, and I think there's going to be even more of us over the next week or two.
Seriously, you know what? We have finally got control. It is a double nerd takeover, and we are not giving the reins back. Who needs the technology? Superstar. Exactly. Well, guys, we are back with another video, and we are doing a rewatch. I'm really excited for this one. We just spent about 45 minutes on Patreon talking through the entirety of the first half of Chelsea, and there was a lot of interesting things that we picked up on, and I think in this video we're going to try to highlight two of those most important things, but I encourage everybody to pop off. There's going to be a link in the description down below as far as checking out if you wanted to, and you could also join as a 7-day free trial. And we've got tons of other things, including Scouteds, including instant reactions, main pods, the works, Wohan's lovely data pod. We've got youth pods. There's just a lot of stuff down there. So if you enjoy the content, please make sure that you sign up for free for a 7-day free trial, or you can support us as well on YouTube. And we also have the stuff all there. All the admin, I think, is out of the way, and I can finally get into the nerdy stuff. So Chelsea rewatch, mate, why don't you give me your quick 30-second elevator pitch about kind of what you saw, what you liked about Chelsea, and what you think we can maybe take forward to Madrid.
Yeah, I mean, we'll obviously go into the individual topic of main discussion from my point of view, but in general, I really liked the flexibility of our rotations in the middle of the park. And we mentioned it on the main pod as well in terms of these dismarking movements that you're going to talk more about in depth that we did, that was allowing us to pull Chelsea players outside of positions that they were more comfortable in order for us to access certain spaces through these movements. And it's Declan Rice has mentioned it before in The Athletic, these movements that we make in order to kind of make it very difficult for opposition players to man mark. And although I don't know if you've seen that interview, viewers, but he spoke about how fluid Arsenal are in terms of how they access spaces further forward and how difficult it is to defend against. And we saw that a lot in that first 30 minutes. And that was certainly something that really appealed to me. And the press, and I think, we'll get into it in a bit, but the press, I think there's a lot of things that we can take forward, something that is ingrained in our DNA, that is absolutely consistent out of possession in what we do there. We can take that into the Real Madrid game in terms of what we do to effectively mitigate the influence that Real Madrid can have in that game. So,
absolutely. And, speaking of the press, we'll just jump right into it. So just to double check, are you able to see my screen, mate, and this lovely tactical board?
I can indeed. Yes.
Okay, brilliant. So the one thing that we noticed, right, going into this is I felt like Declan Rice was making these really brilliant kind of almost dismarking movements where we would have him kind of shoot up into that double pivot. We would see Martin Odegaard come from the right and really drop inside. And, Miles and Timber would be kind of out wide in this instance. And, you almost saw kind of instances where David Raya could step up. And Odegaard, by coming in here, left this space here for Timber to kind of receive as a clip ball over the top, or for David Raya to really find this really smooth pass into Marino, who could drop in. But really, the fundamental part of this was this movement from Odegaard, maybe being at the top of the press, leading it, to then drop when we're in possession, to drop into the pivot and operate along with Thomas Partey. And I think Declan Rice, it was really important as far as he would either float out to the right to create an overload, but primarily for me, he would step up from this pivot role, make space for really Odegaard to drop in here. Thomas Partey could receive, and Miles, if needed, would be an emergency option in that three. And you've got this back three of really Saliba, David Raya, and Gabriel, where really Odegaard and Partey become your main pivot. And our fullbacks are a little bit higher up. And this for me was the general kind of build-up formation that we would kind of look to employ. And it seemed to have a lot of joy against Chelsea, especially against, I think typically you'd have Enzo kind of marking Partey, yes, and then you'd have Nkunku in this weird in-between who didn't know whether to follow Odegaard or Timber, but then Caicedo would drop up and really try to mark kind of Martin Odegaard in this instance, and this space on the right-hand side seemed to be free. Whether that was from a Saliba pass to go into Martinelli, or whether that was, even Odegaard receiving, but then playing some quick balls into the middle of the park. But I think this movement of Martin Odegaard going from top to bottom, and then of course Declan Rice at the same time moving up, or at times shifting across to create that kind of qualitative overload, was something that we saw quite a bit in build-up. What did you make of that build-up kind of point? Did I cover most of the stuff?
No, I think you smashed it really, and I think there's a lot of similarities as well with the PSV game away from home. And I think PSV though, I kind of likened it to facing a Marco Bielsa Leeds team in terms of the man-to-man principles they had. The only difference is that a Marco Bielsa team is a lot more intense, and it is more difficult to be able to compete against that sort of team. But Arsenal generally, they do really well with teams who have man-to-man marking principles in the middle of the park because of how we rotate, and we saw it a lot in this game, which Chelsea, as you've already alluded to, Caicedo on Odegaard, nominally Reece James on Rice, Enzo on Thomas Partey, and then the two wingers on our fullbacks. But what we did really well is, as you mentioned, David Raya coming into central centre-back, or whether it's Thomas Partey dropping into the back line, or whether it's Odegaard dropping in. That meant that Jurrien Timber could stay wider, and also Saliba to stay wider. And what that did is it meant that Nkunku was in a very difficult job of whether to jump towards Saliba or stay towards Timber. If he stays towards Timber, that allows Saliba to carry. If he jumps towards Saliba, Saliba can access that pass into Timber if he times it, and that means Cucurella would then have to jump. And if Cucurella jumps, that means Badiashile, the centre-back, has to come across on Martinelli. And if you look back at the build-up to the corner that we did win, that was the resulting goal-scoring corner, it comes from that specific movement in which Badiashile is dragged across and Martinelli is able to spin off him, getting in behind, putting that cut back in, Chelsea deal with it, and then we score from the resulting corner. So I know obviously the second half was certainly a dull spectacle for I'd say for everyone, but there were a lot of really good things in that first 30 minutes, and I think you've gone through it really well there as well. So
yeah, and I think just to set you up really from the press, because it wasn't just from a build-up perspective, I think our press was phenomenal, and it wasn't just this whole man-marking instance. I'm sure you'll talk about some of the specifics, but I highlighted quite a bit, at least in our rewatch. I kept mentioning his name, Trossard, as somebody who was just an underrated aspect in terms of cleaning up that second ball and really offering himself to support the movement in which Martin Odegaard would really step up, create that initiation of the press. And Mikel Merino actually got about brilliantly, really understood his runs here. And then we know what Declan is like as being that first presser. But I think what gets understated is that Trossard is really that support person in terms of really being able to support any loose balls that we might see. And he's really cheats into the center of the park. And he also cheats back. Like the amount of times that we see turnovers and he's one of the first attackers that are running back, it kind of led us to really debate the future forward purchase in terms of maybe what we're looking at. One winger, one high, one low. But take it away, mate. As far as the press, what impressed you in that Chelsea half, and maybe what we can take to Madrid as well?
Yeah, because I think this is obviously the main interest for Arsenal fans right now, including myself. You know, I think the league-wise, and we'll get second. You know, I don't think the consistency of the other teams outside of us will be enough to kind of stop us despite our injuries. But I think, you know, you can check it out, obviously, with the rewatch. George mentions a lot about, you know, what we're asking certain players to do of our wingers, and then kind of then moving into the summer as to who can really do that role to what we want, but also give us that impetus on the ball in the final third. But the way that we press and how we kind of start off is, you can just think of it very simply, in which Arsenal want to keep a back five deeper on the halfway line. And that back five is our back four and then our defensive midfielder, being Thomas Partey in this game. And the reason we do that is because teams naturally, there's this globalization of structure and familiarization that where you look at teams in terms of how they're building up through the entirety of the league, but also across Europe, it is this 2-4-4 shape. And Real Madrid will do something very similar. They aren't of the traditional JDP type team, but they will still build up in this way when we are pressing. So you imagine the two centre-backs, then the two full-backs of the opposition, and their two midfield players. And for Real Madrid, it'll be most likely Tchouaméni and Camavinga, or Tchouaméni and Dani Ceballos, which he has done as well, Carlo Ancelotti, this season. But in this game, it's Reece James and Caicedo. And as we always have become accustomed to, Martin Odegaard, when he jumps, and by the way, as you mentioned in the rewatch as well, Mikel Merino's role and how he did the press really well in terms of his responsibility, that is something that he hasn't been consistent in, but he did it really well in this game. But when Odegaard jumps, Declan Rice is standing between the two pivot players. He's overloaded, But we want him to be overloaded because we know what Declan Rice can do in the press, and with his frame being able to win the ball and being able to step in when they play that pass into the middle of the park. And Trossard is coming more narrow as the winger to step onto the initial midfield pivot play that Declan Rice was on initially. So you imagine Martin Odegaard is jumping, Declan Rice is then shifting across. So the other pivot player then also needs to be a case of we need to have someone there who can kind of anticipate there just in case Declan Rice can't get there. And that's what Trossard does. And what that meant is Thomas Partey can stay deeper and effectively be this hoover, as you mentioned, to pick up a second ball potentially and to give us that overload. And the beauty of this is we give ourselves enough coverage at the back to deal with balls in behind because we have that extra player in Thomas Partey being that 5 versus the 4, but also we have enough to cause trouble higher up to force a turnover. And we did this a lot in the Chelsea game. So leaving ourselves underloaded higher up, but giving ourselves enough coverage at the back, but we are okay with being underloaded up front because of Declan Rice and because of what Trossard can do. So
yeah, and you know what it leads me to believe when I talk about forward purchases, we kind of mentioned in the video on the Patreon, like when you look, okay, if Zubamendi's coming in, by the way, this Thomas Partey Hoover role, it makes the best use of him because he's not an athletic person that can cover space, but he is somebody that, at least for me, when I've rewatched him, he is very good at anticipating where to be and where he needs to jump. So as far as being like the Jorginho defensive mindset of being there when he needs to be and early, it actually suits that Hoover role quite a bit. If you're going to have Declan be the one that's going to do the running out of possession. And as long as he hoovers into small spaces, which by the way, we create in the way that we press, it could work. But I will say, I think it does require a more hardworking left wing that's able to support that and can cheat into the center of the park, that can do those hard yards. And, you know, I have a look at a certain Antoine Semenyo that I just think would be a perfect match. Price-wise, Arsenal fan, prime age, yada, yada. You've heard it here. We've done a scouted on him. It just is another example of how I feel like he could walk into this team. But mate, that was brilliant. It was a brilliant rewatch as a whole. If you guys do enjoy some of that stuff, we really go into detail about going through some of the films. So if you did like that, you can go down below into the description and you can watch the entire 45 minutes that we've released across Patreon and YouTube via Vimeo. But guys, thank you so much for a lot of your help. We've got some other stuff coming this week. You've got the main pod to catch from yesterday. You've got this rewatch, and we will be doing a TCP live, the two of us. You guys just can't get rid of the double duo. We'll be doing that on Thursday in the usual time around 7 p.m. ish. But guys, thank you so much for sticking with us. Thank you, Rohan.
No, thanks, man. Always a pleasure to do it with you. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. And guys, let us know in the comments if you want us to do a rewatch of another game, or if you would like us to discuss some other topics for TCP Live. We would love to take those suggestions. So thank you so much for sticking with us, and thanks for keeping it Arsenal.